Hello, everyone. This is Catherine Bear at River Network, and want to welcome you to the webinar. We are waiting for people to get on, and so hang tight, and we will be getting started shortly. Hi, everyone. This is Catherine Bear at River Network, and we're just waiting for people to jump onto the webinar. We're getting close to starting, and we should be starting in just a minute. Thanks for your patience, and we'll get started in a minute. Hello, everyone. This is Catherine Bear with River Network, and we, in just a sec, are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar, New Frontiers in Water Efficiency, Integrating Land Use and Water Supply Decisions, and talking about this exciting project we've called NetBlue. So welcome. I'm going to give it one more minute, and we will get started. Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to have a quick introduction and then have a great presentation for all of you. And we will definitely have time for question and answers at the end. But if you have clarification questions during the webinar, please use the chat box and we will try to get to them during the webinar. So first of all, I imagine most of you know about River Network, but if there's anyone new to our organization, I just wanted to quickly let you know that about River Network and what we do. My colleague Gail Killam and I are on here today, and so for almost 30 years, River Network has filled a really unique niche in the environmental community, and we focus on primarily on the 2,000+ river, watershed, and community organizations that work at the local, state, and regional levels and are working towards healthy rivers. Our work, we build a watershed community of effective, strong, and diverse organizations and we try to make sure that these groups have a knowledge and access to information about science and policy so they can deploy these solutions in their community for healthy rivers. We provide our community and anyone interested access to best practices through webinars like this one, via our website, our annual conference, River Rally, publications, and also direct consultation, as well as analysis for groups, coalitions, and leaders around the country. And speaking of River Rally, our annual meeting, River Rally, is coming up this year in April, at the end of April and beginning of May in Lake Tahoe, California. And just so you know, we hope you can join us, but even more important, on October 1st, the abstracts are due for this conference. You can find that information on our website, rivernetwork.org. So I hope you'll join us and consider submitting an abstract to present at this conference. It's really a great, amazing gathering of approximately 500 community and river, watershed, local and state governments, and folks from industry all over the country coming together to network. So today's agenda and speakers, I'm very excited. We've got a great lineup, and we, after the introduction, we will be handing it over to our colleagues Bill Christensen at Water Forever and Adam Schempp at the Environmental Law Institute, and then my colleague Gail Killam will be wrapping up at the end of the webinar. So I'm going to quickly introduce Bill and Adam before providing a short introduction to how River Network got involved in this project and the importance we see in contributing to rivers. So our two speakers today, Bill Christensen now is Water Forever, but he's been in the water industry since 2002. Bill got his start working for planning and management consultants in Illinois. In 2007, Bill joined the Alliance for Water Efficiency, where he worked for 9 years. Bill's work has included research related to many facets of water resource management, policy analysis, water conservation planning and evaluation, benefit cost analysis, drought planning, and water rate evaluation. He's worked with water utilities throughout the U.S. and Canada, and he is representing the Alliance for Water Efficiency today. Adam Schempp is with the Environmental Law Institute, and Adam joined ELI as a staff attorney in 2007. Adam leads the Institute's work on water allocation and use in the United States. Much of Adam's research is focused on water resource management, specifically on identifying opportunities to meet conservation and sustainability objectives through existing laws and potential legal developments. He's also worked extensively on other topics, including the Clean Water Act and the Coastal Zone Management Act. Before joining the Environmental Law Institute, he worked for the Legal Department of Denver Water Board and also for the Native American Rights Fund. So really pleased to have them with us today. So as a quick overview to the NetBlue project and supporting what we're calling water neutral community growth, some background on the project before we jump into really the contents of the model toolkit ordinance, water efficiency, and the methodology, and some really great examples of how this policy could be applied in your community and help your rivers and watershed. So first of all, if we look at water resources and population growth rates around the country, you can see there are certain places that have really high growth rates, in general growing, but especially many of our arid regions are growing really quickly. We see this in the West and the Intermountain West, and also parts of the Southeast where the growth rates will also have very high growth rates. I sit here in North Carolina, and we see it firsthand. So when you combine this growth combined with areas that are starting to experience water stress, having a lot of impacts potentially on our rivers, and this growth is really projected to continue. And there's a disconnect there between land use and water availability, and certainly water quality that we've seen sometimes as advocates, both from stormwater and a water withdrawal perspective. So with that in mind, we know there are a lot of impacts on our rivers, and so those of us who worked in the water community for many years, we see increased stress in our rivers, fish kills, stormwater flooding, and decreased base flows, as well as droughts. The picture in the upper right is from this summer in Alabama. So many of the changes we're seeing in climate are really further exacerbating our water problems. So this project in NetBlue is really an attempt to try to bring together and integrate this disconnect between land use and water supply planning for both people and rivers. And so what we're going to tell you about today is how we've tried to connect the two. This is the project. The NetBlue project is a partnership led by the Alliance for Water Efficiency in partnership with the Environmental Law Institute and River Network. And it started 3 years ago as a project to promote more sustainable communities by trying to link land use and water availability. As you'll hear today, we developed a model ordinance toolkit for communities where you can tailor and create a local policy or another approach for your community. It's flexible. We got input from a number of partner communities around the country who represented a number of different geographies and water environments to try to really provide a reality check and make it operational, something that could be flexible and used in many different places, regardless of what the local situation looks like. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Bill Christensen, and give him control of this. But Bill is going to start us off with some background on water efficiency and what an offset is.
All right. Thank you very much, Catherine. Because such a large piece of this concept is offsetting new demand with water conservation and efficiency with existing customers, I wanted to start out just generally talking about common water efficiency actions that are taken by water utilities and communities. So I thought I'd start with this list, beginning with one of the more important ones, which is education and outreach for customers, educating them on water use and how they can lower their water consumption so they understand these things. Another common strategy is auditing homes and businesses. And what I mean by that is a water utility will go out and visit a home or a business, take note of how they're using water, and identify opportunities for reductions in water use. And that's been a common strategy for decades in the water industry. And then another one that's also very common is retrofitting homes and businesses with efficient fixtures such as toilets and appliances like dishwashers and clothes washers. And you may have heard of things like rebate programs where a water utility will provide an incentive to their customer to adopt new water conserving behavior or install new fixtures and appliances. So some other approaches that are taken are adopting codes and standards, as well as green building specifications. And I'll give you an example of a standard that's actually federal and applies to the whole United States, which is related to toilets. So in the United States, you cannot buy a toilet with a flush volume greater than 1.6 gallons per flush. So that's an example of a standard that's in effect and has caused a lot of water use reductions over time. Older toilets used 3.5 gallons per flush or greater. So it's allowed us to reduce our water use kind of naturally over time. So that's often a strategy that's taken. And then there's things like reducing leakage in a water system and eliminating water loss. It's often called non-revenue water as well. And then pricing water volumetrically is a strategy that's taken as well. And this gives the customer an incentive for using less water and gives them a price signal as to their water use. And then outdoor water used for landscape irrigation is a wonderful strategy as well. Reducing that can save quite a bit of water in a community. So water efficiency is a solution with multiple benefits. And Catherine talked about some of the environmental benefits. And what's less obvious often are the economic benefits. So it can reduce costs for both utilities and customers. So on the utility side, it can reduce their day-to-day operating costs because they're producing and treating less water. But it can also avoid huge costs related to developing new supply or expanding their current capacity. And then on the customer side, using less water lowers utility bills. And it's not just the water bill. The sewer bill can be lower, as well as electric and gas bills. And then another great benefit is that because it reduces energy consumption, it also reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And it serves as an important strategy for maintaining resiliency in the face of climate change. So this slide shows a development, and I like to show this to set the stage. So we see in this image a new development being constructed. It's very obvious what's going in here, some single-family homes. And this will increase the demand for this water utility service area or town, whatever it may be. So this development will increase the amount of water consumed here. And so the concept is that with this going in, let's say this new neighborhood on the screen is going to use 500,000 gallons a year, that we go out into the existing customer base and find opportunity for water savings so that when these new homes come online, the overall impact is neutral. And so we call these water demand offsets. And so here we'll talk about it a little bit more. We see this image on the left, proposed 100 home development. And then how do we combat that new water demand or requirement on the system? We can go out into existing homes and replace fixtures and appliances. And we have here a WaterSense toilet and some homes representing existing customers. Or we could do things like rainwater harvesting, like we see here in the second image. Maybe that will allow us to lower demands and offsets. And then some other communities have used banks. So they'll charge perhaps a developer a fee for their development, and then that money will go into a fund that will be used to implement water conservation programs and bring down the system-wide water demand. So to kickstart this effort, the Alliance for Water Efficiency reviewed existing ordinances that are in effect. We also reviewed the terminology related to water demand offset policies, any research that had been conducted. But I'd say the meat and potatoes of it was reviewing the existing and past policies. There were many examples in California, also in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and examples out on the East Coast as well. So it really provided a great basis for developing this example ordinance and let us move into the next phase of the project, which is developing the NetBlue toolkit. So the toolkit includes many resources, including the model ordinance, and the model ordinance comes with a user guide. And it also has 3 great examples of how to use the ordinance and what was generating using it. We also created an offset methodology workbook, and this allows the user to look at various water conservation strategies to determine what would be the best approach and to select how an offset will be achieved. And that also comes with a user guide, and there are 3 examples that match the model ordinance examples using that workbook. And there are additional outreach materials provided online as well. And so this slide, not only does it list the various pieces of the NetBlue toolkit, but it's also kind of the outline for the remainder of the presentation today. So now I will pass it off to Adam Schimpf with the Environmental Law Institute.
Thanks, Bill. So as Bill mentioned, ELI started the development of this model ordinance using his great research in that report that he just noted. And I do commend it to any of you who might be interested in getting some of the background on what the experiences have been of these different municipalities, or I should say communities. We added to that other examples, concepts from literature on the subject, and consideration of various scenarios with the help of the Project Advisory Committee, which we haven't mentioned yet, but it was a handful of really talented, experienced folks from a very diverse group of sectors that helped us not only develop but also vet not only the ordinance but also the various worksheets that Bill was just mentioning. So really trying to keep this as practical on the ground as possible. We then tore all these pieces apart and started rebuilding this Frankenstein of sorts. The parts of the existing ordinance appear throughout the model ordinance worksheet. In fact, each section has a hyperlink to the ordinances that provided some of the language or concepts in that section to provide you more context and give you some references to rely on. But just the existing water offset ordinances were insufficient to address all of the foreseeable scenarios for which this product might be used, and therefore we needed some glue and some additional pieces to try to put in to make it whole. And for this we relied on other laws for that language and that structure. Let's see. There we go. But unfortunately, the reality is that this tool can't address all the factors. There are just too many local details, different legal, political, social, hydrologic, and other constraints. When we started the project, we knew that a traditional one-size-fits-all model ordinance really wouldn't work for this purpose. So we chose to develop a worksheet that would help users build an ordinance that is right for them. We put as many options as we could in there without being overwhelming, we hope, and added some explanatory language in text boxes. The worksheet is meant to be a start to the conversation, helping individuals of any background or role identify and think through the key issues for adopting this approach in his or her community. We expect communities will tinker with the language even beyond the confines of the worksheet itself, and I'll explain a little bit more what the worksheet looks like, what it does in just a minute. But before that, I want to give you a better idea of the structure of the worksheet. We created it to look a lot like the ordinance would ultimately, so breaking it down by its respective pieces. It starts with the legal foundation, the intent behind the adoption of the ordinance, the factual basis for adopting the ordinance, and the authority of the adopting entity to adopt that ordinance. Then comes the meat of the ordinance, details regarding the requirement or incentives offered, the definitions, some of which are critical to the breadth and effect of the ordinance, how the offset amount is determined, which I'll get into more detail in a minute, actually later in the webinar, and the approved offset activities. Also, how the ordinance is enforced, the deadline for completing the offsets, how completion is verified, and remedies for failing to comply. Monitoring after the fact is an optional but highly suggested component of the ordinance, and I'll be talking about that in greater detail later as well. Similarly, the next 4 sections need not be included in the ordinance but might be desirable. An offset credit bank, which Bill had mentioned earlier, we fashioned this one largely off of the one in Santa Fe. An in lieu fee option, which I'll be discussing in greater detail later, and a requirement that certain fees be paid to cover administrative expenses, as well as a process for requesting a modification like a waiver or a variance. Finally, some of the basics. Who may appeal and through what process, the fact that the rest of the ordinance remains intact if one part is deemed illegal or unenforceable, a clarification on the effect that the ordinance has on other laws, and when the ordinance takes effect. So just as some of the ordinance sections are optional, each section is filled with options for tailoring. This is a screenshot of the start of the purpose section to help me explain the functionality of it. There is mandatory language, which is in black and not preceded by a checkbox. So you'll see that with like the first bullet, for example, protect and promote the public health, safety, and general welfare. We really strongly recommend using this language, but even in the automated version, the worksheet that results, you can still change it as you like. But we have intentionally made this not an optional portion because we really, really recommend that you keep that language in there. The checkboxes that you see give you the opportunity to include or not include any of those sections. Many of these sections have an insert other component at the bottom to allow you to tailor this even further than some of the examples that we provide in here. The blue text identifies fill in the blanks, with the text serving as a guide as to what information to insert, so identified city, county, or district as an example. The purple text denotes multiple choices, which will appear in a drop-down box when you check that or click on that purple language. There are 2 versions of this worksheet, an automated one, which will create a Word document with all of your selections, the checkboxes, fill in the blanks, drop-down selections, when the Press Me button at the end of the document is checked. This works best, by the way, in Word 2010, just as a warning. There also is an unautomated version of the worksheet, same text, just without the word macros. And with that, I'll turn it back to Bill.
All right, thank you, Adam. So for this next portion, I'm going to take you through some screen captures of the methodology workbook itself. So this is built in Microsoft Excel, and it's designed to help communities evaluate and then choose various water demand offsets for new development projects. So here we are looking at the first screen, and I will click over to the next screen. there we go. So the different components, just before I do take you through the various screens, it requires the user to enter new demand information so that water demand of a new development is entered. And then you go through the various worksheets and evaluate different offset strategies. And this can include what we would consider fairly typical or common water conservation strategies, but it also includes some worksheets that allows the user to evaluate rainwater harvesting and stormwater capture as well. And then last, we included some supplemental worksheets that allow the user to create a general estimate of the number of inefficient toilets in a given service area or community. And we included that because replacing inefficient toilets with efficient toilets is a very tried and true water conservation strategy. It generates fairly reliable savings that are easy to predict, and it's often a very cost-effective strategy as well. So you get a lot of savings for your money. And the predictability of these various strategies is a critical piece of this effort as well. Sorry, the slides got away from me a little bit there, but here we are on the offset strategy worksheet. And I'm going to give a fairly high-level overview of this and not get too into the details. But here in the first step, where the cursor is hovering over, the user enters a name or description about the project or new development, and then enters the amount of water that is predicted or estimated for the new development. And you can do that in gallons per year, million gallons per year, or acre feet. And then we also have liters and megaliters for users on metric system. And what we maybe haven't discussed in great detail is some of these offset requirements have different, what we call offset ratios. So some may require 100% of the demand of the new development be offset, while others may require 200%, and some may require less than 100%. So that's entered by the user, and then the total offset amount is estimated here where I'm hovering the cursor. Down below, the user defines and selects various water demand offset strategies. It comes with built-in strategies that I mentioned are kind of more common, and it also includes example savings estimates for those strategies. The user ultimately has to enter whatever they would like to use for the estimate, and then they select whether or not they would like to include that as a strategy. There is also plenty of space for the user to include any custom offsets that they have designed themselves and may not be included in the worksheet. So once they've worked through all of that and selected the offsets that they would like to explore further and include, they move over to the selected offsets worksheet and click this button that says Update Selected Offsets Table. And then the user just has to enter the number of each strategy that would be implemented. So if they were going to replace high or inefficient toilets, they would select the number of toilets they were going to replace. And then the worksheet gives you feedback in terms of whether or not you're meeting 100% of that offset requirement. And I mentioned the inefficient toilet stock estimator, and here is the worksheet showing how that is used. It uses housing data for communities to estimate inefficient toilets. So the Energy Policy Act went into effect in 1994, and I mentioned earlier that you now can only buy a toilet with a 1.6 gallon per flush volume or less. And because of that, older homes built before 1994 could potentially have some inefficient toilets. And that will tell you what that opportunity is within your given community. So it's a pretty cool worksheet that gives you quite a bit of insight as to whether or not there are toilets to be replaced. The workbook also includes a worksheet related to rainwater harvesting, and the user can use this to estimate offsets off-site, but also will allow the user to look at on-site water savings. One of our examples we'll talk about later utilizes rainwater harvesting to flush toilets on-site. And so in that particular example, this spreadsheet was used to estimate the reduction in potable water use through rainwater harvesting. And the workbook also interfaces with the EPA's National Stormwater Calculator and uses the outputs from that to help determine the amount of stormwater runoff that might be available to be captured and used as a potential offset. So those are the different pieces of the workbook, and if you have any questions on them specifically, please don't hesitate to ask during the question and answer period. So now I pass it back to Adam.
Terrific, thank you. All right, so we recognize that people may want to see what might result from the worksheet that I was talking about earlier before embarking on that endeavor. And for that reason, we created 3 examples to sort of show the range of options that a NetBlue ordinance might entail. The example ordinances that we'll be discussing here and are available were all created using the worksheet, so just inputting certain information and generating the result. So the exact same process as anyone else would go through. Bill also created associated offset examples to give users a better idea of what those might look like. And we'll now jump into some descriptions of the details. So the first example is the most robust one, requiring over 100% offset of the projected net increase in annual water demand for purposes of considering system losses, firefighting and other health and safety issues, and incorporating a margin of safety in the calculation. It also required monitoring after occupancy and applies to new buildings, remodels, as well as changes of use. In this example, the ordinance was adopted by city government. The source of water at issue is surface water, and the problem being addressed is frequent water shortages. Bill?
All right, thank you. So we created an example new development to use the workbook and demonstrate how it can be used. So for this particular example, we have 5 single-family homes that are being built. They're 4-bedroom, 2-bath, and 2 half-bath. So that's kind of the characteristics of the homes. And the projected annual water demand of those 5 new homes is 500,000 gallons per year. And because the required offset amount is 110%, the offset required is 550,000 gallons per year. And so in this particular example, the workbook was used to analyze the offset strategy of replacing single-family toilets that have a 3.5 gallon per flush or greater with WaterSense toilets that use 1.28 gallons per flush. So each toilet replaced is estimated to save 10,000 gallons a year. And so replacing 55 of these toilets will effectively meet that offset. And the examples that we've constructed are available in documents and contain screen captures of how the workbook was used.
All right. Going on to example 2. This is the most basic of the examples in terms of the ordinance. It offers incentives to offset the projected net increase in annual water demand rather than requiring it. To be eligible for the incentives, only 75% of the projected demand increase needs to be offset, and water use monitoring after occupancy is not expected in order to receive the incentives. In this example, the ordinance was adopted by county government to address a mounting saltwater intrusion problem to their groundwater resources. An in lieu fee option is included in this example, and as I mentioned earlier, I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get done with this section. Bill?
All right, so for this offset, we created an example multi-unit development. So the slide is coming in. So we have a multi-unit office building that is the new development being proposed. and the projected annual water demand is 5.8 acre-feet, which is equal to 1.9 million gallons. And we use the different units of measure to demonstrate the workbook's functionality in that regard. And so the offset amount here is 75%, which would be 4.35 acre-feet, or around 620,000 gallons per year. And so here, the offset strategy is just a little more complicated, and it's going to include various retrofits of commercial facilities as the water utility identifies. So in this example, we had 8 restaurants that replaced their pre-rinse spray valves, and those are valves that are used to rinse off dishes before they go in the dishwasher. And inefficient valves waste a lot of water, and there are some great high efficiency models on the market. Also, there are 2 restaurants that, in addition to replacing their spray valves, are going to replace their dishwashers and food steamers, which can be huge opportunities for savings. And then they also worked with 1 laundromat that'll replace 6 of its clothes washers to high efficiency models, and 1 office building that will replace 8 of its urinals for increased efficiency. And then they found 30 single family and 30 multifamily toilet replacement opportunities. So there is a suite of strategies that is employed to meet that particular offset. So pass it back to Adam.
And on to example 3. This one's not quite as robust as the first one, but also not quite as basic as the second one. It requires a 100% offset of the projected net increase in annual water demand, requires monitoring after occupancy, although not for as long nor with as many connections to enforcement as the first example. And those monitoring requirements are purely for data collection purposes. And it applies only to site plan approval requests. In the example, the ordinance was adopted by county government to address anticipated water shortages from surface supplies. Also of note in this example, allowable offsets include reduced water consumption on irrigated ag lands and alternative sources of water supply, as defined in the definition section, include water sustainably obtained from sources unconnected to the surface water source at issue here. If that's something that you would like to talk about in greater detail, please ask a question of that in the Q&A portion. We hadn't built that into this discussion explicitly, but I'm certainly glad to talk about it. Bill?
All right, and for this example offset, we have a new beer brewery coming online, and its projected annual water demand is 1.75 million gallons per year. And the offset requirement is 100%, so they have to offset that entire 1.75 million gallons. And here we have an interesting strategy. Because it's a large facility and they have a very large roof, they're collecting on-site rainwater. So they're going to harvest rainwater, and they're going to use it to flush toilets. And they're also going to use single-family toilet replacements to complete the additional need for that offset. So they determined by using this workbook that they could meet 100% of their toilet flushing needs, which brought down what we call their on-site water consumption. And then they additionally have 330,000 gallons of excess that could be used for an off-site offset. And so to complete the addition of that, they're going to conduct 129 single-family toilet replacements. So they're kind of mixing some old school strategy with the single-family toilet replacements, and then what I would consider more cutting-edge strategy of rainwater harvesting to meet their offset. So it's kind of a cool example and shows the functionality of the workbook. And so back to you, Adam.
Thanks. Well, in my closing few minutes, I would like to highlight a couple of parts, or actually 3 parts of the worksheet, to give you a better idea of its functionality and to really discuss some of the bigger issues to be considered here. I'd like to start with something that we've referenced a number of times already in this worksheet, in this webinar, and that is the percentage of offset that is required, or as the case may be, necessary to receive any incentives. once the total projected demand is determined for the proposed project and any existing demand or alternative sources of supply are subtracted, that figure is multiplied by the percentage identified in the ordinance. Bill had mentioned it in his worksheets. The point here really is of the demand that is expected to go online once the new project is fully functional, how much of that are you expecting the user or the applicant to offset in order to be in compliance with whatever expectations your community has for water neutrality, so to speak. So this percentage can be high. Bill already mentioned that some of the examples had 200% listed as their expectation. But I would highly recommend that anything over 100% be very clearly enunciated in the ordinance as to why it's above that 100%, why you're asking people to go beyond what is calculated just for their particular development. And we list here a number of reasons, not to say that these are all of them, but that margin of safety, as I mentioned before, community health, particularly firefighting issues, system losses, and in some cases even protecting ecological health. Some of these factors that may not be fully incorporated into the calculus of what that individual development would be requiring in terms of water usage on site. The percentage also could be low. It could be significantly under 100%, and I think that this is particularly relevant in areas where a problem such as water scarcity or saltwater intrusion is mounting, and the purpose of adopting an ordinance like this is to start doing something about it sooner rather than later. If the problem's worse, but the ordinance is doing something to help with mitigating the impacts, then increasing the percentage at that point would make a lot of sense. But at least you've laid the groundwork, the ordinance is in place, and the change is really changing the percentage as opposed to adopting the ordinance whole cloth. And people are, over time, people are still contributing to addressing the effort as opposed to an all or nothing switch for adopting this ordinance later. The second topic I want to cover is monitoring. So it's commonly an afterthought in these ordinances, but it can be very important to assuring that the ordinance is having the effect that's intended. Monitoring might be done just to gather information, as I mentioned with some of the previous examples, to know how the ordinance should be amended to be effective in the future. But it also could be tied to enforcement, requiring water usage to comply with the projected demand or additional offsets to be completed if that projection and the actual usage are not in alignment. You also can use monitoring for purposes of incentives. So if a development happens to be more efficient than the projection, then you could be providing some credits, whether they could be sold in a credit bank or could be used for a new development that those credits are then useful to that individual, and it takes it from just being a planning exercise to actually being an execution. But all of this really comes back to monitoring, laying out those expectations at the start. What are people required to do once the development is completed, or in the case of a larger development, a certain percentage of the development is completed in order to really demonstrate that the effects are what were anticipated. And finally, getting into the sticky issue of in lieu fees. They can be really attractive to everyone involved as a simple way to meet the requirements of the ordinance. But one needs to ensure that the objective of the ordinance is also being met, not just the very strict rules within the ordinance. So it can be really easy to simply collect the fees, have a growing coffer of funds, and be unable to turn those funds into the water use reductions equivalent to the demands that have already been allowed. What we're talking about here is after the fact water efficiency, as opposed to what you might see in something like Santa Fe's water bank, where people are banking credits for activities that they already did, and that efficiency is already in place. It's already guaranteed, it occurs, and then you're allowing the development as a result. So the worksheet suggests caution when considering an in lieu fee option. The language that we crafted here is protective. You'll see a large number of non-optional parts of this section, including that a fund exclusively for the water offset purpose have been created to avoid poaching of this money for other purposes, and that a program exists to spend that money in very clear ways. The worksheet also outlines some of the specific reasons that an in lieu fee may be used, such as certain locations, sizes of buildings, or types of activities. It can ease the burden of the obligations under the ordinance, particularly for smaller projects, so that while your intention may be for an ordinance like this to really be effective for everyone or affect everyone, the in lieu fee might help you with some of the more de minimis issues without you having to outline them explicitly in the ordinance. But I highly recommend that an in lieu fee not be used as a default to approaching the ordinance in all instances. So I'd be happy to answer any questions about these elements of the worksheet or any others after Gail and Catherine do the wrap-up. So with that, I will toss it back to, I believe, you, Gail.
Thanks, Adam. Great summary for all. I just am wanting to direct people to places where they can find more information on both the ordinance and the ordinance toolkit and the workbook. We have on the website that's listed here, www.net-blue.org, a fact sheet with pretty detailed frequently asked questions. And also on that website, you can request the toolkit, both the ordinance and the workbook separately, and you'll be provided with a place to find it. It's not directly available on the website just because of accessibility and the details of the workbook in particular. With that in mind, I think the next slide shows you what the website actually looks like, and we at this point can open up for more questions. Here's the website. So you can see that you have the opportunity to get the initial research that Bill mentioned, as well as the model ordinance and the offset methodology. And it also has lots more information about the project itself. Please go to that. There's a lot of great information and tools, and both the ordinance and the offset methodology have guidebooks to help you understand and navigate through them. With that in mind, we're going to head to some questions that we've had coming in, and I'm going to encourage everybody to use the chat box to the right to type in questions you might have, and we'll get to them as they come in. I'm going to start with one that came from Dan. Actually, he has 3 in here. So I'll start with the first one. And this could be, I think this could be for both Bill and Adam. You guys can decide who starts with it. What has been the experience with uptake or use of these ideas in terms of additional staff capacity or other costs? So talking really about willingness to take it on and what the capacity of a given entity might be. I wonder if, Bill, you want to start with that because of your research?
Sure. That's a really great question, and I think it's something communities do need to consider as they take this on. And a lot of it will have to do with what is currently in place. So if we take an example community that is already doing a lot with water conservation and efficiency, both at the utility level and perhaps in the planning and zoning department, and a lot of that infrastructure and staffing is in place, I think, the additional cost may be minimal. But if we're looking at a community that doesn't have a lot of that in place, or they haven't implemented much in the way of conservation, which would probably be fairly rare for a community enacting this type of ordinance, But if they don't have a lot of that in place, there could be costs for new full-time employees, as an example, and carrying that out. So I don't have any specific numbers as an example. I will say, you know, Adam was talking about the in lieu fee option. We did see a community in California, and it's detailed in the initial literature review report, where they used in lieu fees, but they were unable to spend that money and generate the water savings through conservation programs. And so that fund built up, I think, to be over $1 million in offset fees, but the conservation programs were never carried out, or at least they weren't at the time that report was finished. So they may have completed all of that now. But that's a great question and something to consider when adopting this type of approach. So Adam, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, that was a good way to cover, I think, what the practical experience has been. I would also add that it really depends on how you structure the ordinance, how many different types of developments, or whether you're talking about commercial, residential, whether you're talking about renovations as well. I mean, how extensive are you trying to make this program? How much development do you have going on in your community? And where do the responsibilities lie? How complex do you make this ordinance, basically? And one of the things that we try to be very cognizant of when we were putting this together is that you could make this rather simple, or you could make this quite complex. And I think because really we're hoping that for large counties or large municipalities might be undertaking something like this, just as small municipalities might be undertaking something like this. And obviously the capacity of each is very, very different. And so the expectations in terms of how you calculate the projected water demand, who does it, how much you're relying on default scenarios versus real specifics of the design of the intended development. There are a lot of, I apologize for not having been able to go into the worksheet in greater detail than I was, but there are a lot of different pieces in here that are optional in terms of what kind of burdens you put on the local government and how extensive you make the ordinance as a whole. And I think that will make a big difference in terms of what you might be expecting on the ground when you start to try to implement something like this.
Thanks for those answers. Actually, you started addressing one of Dan's other questions. I'm just going to add it because I think there's a little bit of a nuance here. Assuming this is targeting bottom-up implementation, can you speak to any pointers or lessons learned in navigating the different scales of authorities? You've kind of touched on that. He puts in here city, county, PUD versus state versus fed plus tribal or international. So you started talking about that, Adam. I wonder if you want to add to anything based on this question.
Well, we're trying to make this, as I mentioned at the beginning, sort of a start to the conversation, recognizing that it really wasn't going to be a one-size-fits-all type of opportunity. And one of the things, not to deviate too much from the question here, I'll try to come back to it, but one of the things that as I'm thinking of it, I would really want to highlight is that I think there are a lot of elements in the worksheet and with the work that AWE has done with regard to those workbooks that are useful beyond just the specific purpose that we're talking about here. I think that there are concepts that can be pulled out and tweaked and used for other purposes that may not be immediately within the true NetBlue concept. One example that comes to mind is just if people were looking for a way to address vast reductions in water in flow rates in a local stream or river, and that you're not just trying to protect that river from getting worse, but you're actually looking to restore that river, get water back into the system as a result of some of these approaches, a NetBlue-esque approach to water development. I would highly caution you against making that a part, and we've actually kind of done it in the worksheet of trying to prevent that, making that a clear part of this type of an ordinance, because you really do need to keep it connected to the original points of what that development the consequences that development may be causing for the supply of that county or that city or that utility. It really comes back to the service provider. But you can take those concepts in terms of if it was an incentive-based program, if it was a certification program, something along those lines where a developer were to take up this, let's say 160% of their projected demand calculated by using AWE's tools to identify a way in which they could not only offset their demand, but also create more water that would be not withdrawn from the river and presumably, depending on the water allocation laws of your locality, be able to be put back into the stream and in some way protected there. So there are ways that you could use this, not just for what we're talking about here. But going back to ways of navigating, we hadn't really considered this for international purposes or cross-boundary purposes. I think it's really been focused on within a jurisdiction and trying to. There's so many other permutations that we had to deal with that was enough. But I think Bill may be able to speak a little bit more to some of the experiences that the examples that we looked at have had. But again, I don't view them as having dealt with some of the issues that you mentioned. And the federal component certainly comes into play depending on, or can come into play depending on where you are, what sort of authorities the federal government may have in those areas, to what extent you're dealing with federal property. And again, that's something that we just hadn't dealt with in this ordinance per se.
Bill, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
I don't have anything to add to that. I think Adam covered that great.
Okay. There's another area here that's some questions on consumptive and non-consumptive use. The question reads, seems like this is primarily in the context of an existing shared water provider, so catchment scale water budgeting may not apply, but can you speak to any of your experience differentiating consumptive and non-consumptive use?
Do you want me to take this one, Bill?
Sure.
All right, I'll give it a start. As I mentioned, yeah, one of the challenges of this work, as much as it would be really nice to put this in a watershed context, particularly for any of you that are from prior appropriation states, it can get really, really tricky to navigate any takings issues and the water rights that can be associated with anyone's individual water usage when you're trying to reduce consumption. And that's why we really tried to keep it within the context of the supply that is owned by whatever the government entity may be. One of the things we haven't talked about actually on this webinar is the importance of the connection between, in many cases, the utility and the land use the land use authority are not one and the same and may not even talk well with one another. And it's one of the things that, while it presents a lot of challenges here, we're hoping that, as I mentioned, this being a starter of a conversation could begin to, whether from a groundswell of local support or one of those entities trying to take it up and use it as a means of talking with the other entity, as a basis for starting to connect the water supply with land use decisions. But anyway, getting back to the question at hand, I think that there are components of this that could be extracted and used to help with the management of a watershed, but it is not meant to necessarily be overlaid on a watershed, because especially for anybody that's dealing with a state with forfeiture or enforced forfeiture in a prior appropriation state, you can run into a lot of legal issues and a lot of pushback to approaching reductions in water usage the same way that you might in a community that's all within one set of water rights. So it has some practicality there, and I think there are pieces that could be valuable, but on the whole, it's not meant for that broader scale approach, unless again you're within a single jurisdiction for those purposes.
Yeah,
So
and if I might add to that, there are there are some situations throughout North America where you'll have neighboring communities. I know of one example in Michigan where there are neighboring communities right next door to each other, and if you looked at an aerial view, they look identical, but they have very different water supplies. One of the communities gets groundwater locally, and the other community imports water from fairly far away. So to put them both under the same policy because they reside in the same watershed could get tricky just because their supplies are very different. So that's just one example, and I think that's not necessarily common, but it does exist throughout the United States where communities that may be in the same watershed have very different water supplies. So it's kind of tricky.
I'll add to that one more thing. Building off of Bill's comment and pinpointing one of the areas within the ordinance that could be useful is the credit bank, the water offset credit bank, that you may have different municipalities, different jurisdictions, but they're still all using the same, whether it's groundwater source or surface water source, and that given your geography and given the geology, if you're talking about groundwater, this may not apply, but there could be circumstances in which it would make sense to have a more universal credit bank where if you are reducing withdrawals in one location, even in a different jurisdiction, that the impact to the supply is the same as if you were doing it in your own, and I could see those credits crossing those boundaries. But in the situation that Bill just mentioned, that's a good example of where that would not apply.
We're getting comments in about great answers, guys, just to give you a pat on the back. Here's another one that is related, and you both can tell me if you've already answered it, but I think there's a little something different here about determining whether the offsets are adequate. So how are you determining offsets as being adequate when, even though diversions reduced for water savings still result in an overall increase in consumptive use? So we're dealing with the consumptive use question still, but different diverted volumes. So diverted volumes and consumptive volumes should be two very separate conversations, and mitigation usually requires a reduction in consumptive use. Let you tell me if you think you've already answered that, but I think it's it seems a little different. I don't know, I would send that probably to Bill first. What do you think?
Sure. Yeah, I can start with some comments, and we'll see if we answer the question fully. And I'll take the angle of calculating estimates for water savings with water conservation and efficiency strategies is not a perfect science. So you may have a toilet replacement program, and I called that old school when I was talking about the beer brewery example, and I called rainwater harvesting more new school. And that in no way, shape, or form was meant to make toilet replacements sound like a bad strategy. In fact, one of the things I mentioned earlier in the presentation that's great about them is that their savings is fairly predictable, whereas something like rainwater harvesting is more difficult. Because it depends on the weather, which we all know is challenging to predict. So in some cases, that's why a community may build in an offset requirement that is greater than 100% to have a little bit of a buffer. But it's also why we took great care with the workbook and providing savings estimates and making sure our methods weren't overestimating savings per se. At the end of the day, it is up to the user to select what their savings estimate is going to be, and there should be some due diligence there to make sure those estimates meet the approval of planning bodies. But it is a challenge in terms of saying with great certainty what those savings will be. That said, you could get greater savings than what is estimated. That's certainly not impossible. But it is important to take great care in creating those estimates moving forward as offsets are selected. So that's a great question. I don't know if I answered it perfectly, but I think that is a great consideration.
I'll tackle it from a slightly different perspective, and I don't know if this is what the question was really getting at, but we've now had several people mention the difference between diversion amounts and consumption amounts, and that is, I think anytime you're talking about municipal efficiency, that's a very valuable, valid approach to the discussion. Obviously, for a lot of these efficiencies that we've been talking about, toilet flushes, dishwashers, etc., they are not very consumptive. You're talking about water that is, other than system leakages, for the most part, that comes in and goes back out, is treated, and presumably put back into the system, put back into the natural system. So again, because the approach of this project was largely what are utilities doing, what kind of supplies do the utilities need, and I'll set aside for a moment water reclamation and reuse, and I'll get back to that, and if I don't, remind me. But it really is looking at demand, what amount of water needs to be withdrawn at any point, which is still a very important consideration. But I agree that if you're looking at this more from a net value to the water system, that the consumption element, there is a difference between reductions in, or let's say taking out lawns, taking out grass areas in your lawn, like Nevada and a number of, Las Vegas and a number of other municipalities incentivize people to do, that type of an approach is different for the system than a more efficient toilet. Now, thinking about water reclamation and reuse, one of the things that we did not cover in this are what your alternative sources of supply might be for a development, and to what extent, as Bill mentioned, rainwater harvesting on-site may be a part of that. Potentially off-site could be a part of that. Whether you have a system that is capturing you have a system that's capturing rainwater and is otherwise using it for some of these purposes like flushing toilets, that you can define what you want to count or not count as an alternative source of water supply for these developments, and that makes a difference in terms of what your projected total demand is, and hence how much you may need to offset. So it is factored in there. One of the things that we tend to be very cautious about, going back to the larger system, is also just bringing in additional sources of supply. You certainly have examples like Santa Fe, where purchasing water rights can be a means of offsetting your demand. We intentionally, in this product, were very clear that it is not from the source that is at issue here, because again, if you're just, you may be out of the jurisdiction, but you're still pulling from the same source, you're still having the same additional impact to the source as you would otherwise if you were just pulling water from your area. That's not beneficial. We need to be very clear about that. Likewise, we put in the word sustainably there. I couldn't think of anything necessarily much stronger than that would be fairly universal, but that's the idea, is that if you are pulling water from another place to offset your demand in this particular locale, that this is something that we want to be done with great care. And it is something that is optional, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's recommended. But it is something that we know that a lot of places, a lot of municipalities look to as an additional source of meeting the new demand. And so it was something that we felt like we couldn't necessarily leave out.
Adam, thanks for addressing the alternative supply question that we've wrestled with. Amy, who had posed that question, had a response, and I just want to read this, so in case there's anything else you want to say. It was specifically related to rainwater harvesting. Is intercepting water that would have normally become available to another water user, so you're increasing your consumptive use and not providing any quote-unquote new water. This is what you just addressed, I know, in a different way a little bit. I am in a new appropriation state. So much of what you're discussing would not work.
Yep.
And then she followed up that with, it sounds as if the conversation is one in which very little is applicable to the state of Montana, which I'm guessing she is in, but thank you. And wondering if we had developed this to address only the Southwest.
No, not at all. It's meant to be rather manipulable, and we tried to make it as, I mean, even a state like Colorado that has its issues with rain barrels, tried to make it as applicable across the board as possible. That's why there are so many check boxes. If you're operating within the supply, and I don't know all municipalities, so please correct me if I'm wrong, or if this does not apply to you, then I would gladly back off on it. But within the water rights that a municipality may have, you're not necessarily subjected to those same types of issues that you're talking about if you were looking to purchase a new water right. If you were just trying to come online as a new farm or something of that nature, we're talking about building yourself into the city or county's water rights that already exist. And how does a municipality not have to go out and get additional water rights in order to afford new demand? And this is one of the approaches to doing it. Now, what you count as an offset, what you count as an alternative source of water supply can very much depend on where you are. And these things like rainwater harvesting may not fly legally even in your jurisdiction. But it's not a reason to write off the whole thing. It's just something you wouldn't provide as an option.
Thank you. Woo, complicated stuff. I'm going to switch to a different question from Gwen. How does this approach affect the economics of water utilities? Part 1. Part 2, can it be linked to per capita energy savings from water conservation as a co-benefit? I'm not sure who wants to tackle that. Either one of you.
I'll start out. I'll go ahead and start, and then if Adam has anything to add. In terms of the economics related to water utilities, I kind of touched on that in the intro slides, and it typically has a positive benefit to the utility because lower water use results in lower operating costs on a variable scale. So if you're producing and treating and delivering less water, it'll reduce the utility's costs related to that. And then long term, where very large savings will come from is reducing or avoiding altogether costs with developing and acquiring new supplies, and then building new capacity expansion. So if new customers come online, that may require a utility to build new storage to accommodate those customers, depending where they are in regard to their system and the current customer base. But typically it benefits the utility economically. And that's a lot of what is done when one's planning water conservation programs, is looking at the benefits and the costs of implementation. So I mentioned, I'm harping on toilet programs again, but I pointed them out not only as reliable, but cost effective, because typically the cost of installing a new toilet versus the benefits it produces in terms of water savings, the benefits usually greatly outweigh the costs. So in terms of that, I think, it's typically a benefit, but it's always good to look at the numbers.
The only things that I would add to that, I think that there are a lot of economic factors that go into these types of decisions. I mean, what you may be getting and what it may cost you for new development to go in, whether you're talking about residences and the cost of schooling and so forth. I mean, just more community-wide pros and cons of whatever new development it may be, residential or commercial, that's being considered. That the water elements are but one factor of that. I agree with what Bill said. I would also acknowledge that reductions in usage can mean that the cost per gallon realistically has to go up because the costs are somewhat fixed. I agree with Bill that you can reduce some of those treatment needs and so forth, but you still have infrastructure costs that are somewhat fixed, and being able to still provide for those while you may have actually fewer gallons of water being used or the same amount of gallons being used can be tough, and it's certainly the predicament that a lot of utilities are finding themselves in right now financially. So not to overshadow that, not to sidestep that, but I would also highlight, particularly in areas, what Bill mentioned, particularly in areas where the alternative sources of water, buying new water rights, are both economically, dollar-wise expensive, and as well as politically challenging. And again, going back to the Mountain West or California or where have you, buy and dry is not popular anymore. And so what kind of options you may have with regard to actually getting new supplies and how much that's going to cost you can be tough. And that also will have to get incorporated back into the economics of the utility. So there are a lot of factors at play, and I think that it would just be the circumstances of that particular place as to to what degree this is a positive, or in some cases potentially challenging approach for a utility.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Bill. I don't know that I touched on the second part of that question.
Okay.
Would you mind reading the second part of that again?
Yeah. The first part was, how does this approach affect the economics of water utilities? The second part was, can it be linked to per capita energy savings from water conservation as a co-benefit?
Okay, so yeah, I think it would, and if I don't answer this perfectly, please let us know and I can take another stab at it, but it would reduce per capita overall for the service area, and it would generate co-benefits of reduced energy consumption and thus reduced greenhouse gas emissions.
Great. We are hoping that more people will type in questions, but in the meantime, we have a couple of good ones here that we're going to tackle that are ones that we hear a lot from others. I was wondering if you guys would tackle the question of how, and I think Adam, maybe you start with this, how a community can construct a pilot or a starting point in easing into the ordinance. You addressed it a little bit in your summary, but maybe go over that a little bit more.
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways to do this, and you could take a geographic approach, and that it's a particular area, a particular region of a service area or a county or what have you that you're trying to try this out in. A more realistic possibility is one that I already mentioned in terms of piloting insofar as it's a lower percentage to start. There's less of a burden on developers to do it. One of the things that we have seen, San Diego was an example of this, where this was built into an emergency provision. And I would caution against making this something that's temporal, that's sunsetted or only kicks in at certain times, because development is a much more long-term process. These are not things that necessarily happen within weeks that you might be going, or months that you're going through a drought. It all of a sudden becomes rather difficult if, 1 month you've got this this additional element to approving a proposal, and then the possibility that next month you won't have that, and do people just kind of wait, and it gets very weird. So I wouldn't necessarily make it temporal like you often see with a lot of different pilots within particularly the water community, demonstrating to, for those of you in the West, legislatures in terms of that new strategies won't make the sky fall, that temporal approach can be good, but in this case I don't think that that's really the approach to take. So you also can modify the application. This can be what types of proposals are you addressing, commercial, residential, at what stage of the process, what size of developments are you looking at. So you could address bigger ones and then start to make it apply to others as needed. And there was one more good approach. I'll think of it. I don't know if Bill wants to chime in with anything.
I don't know that I have
requirements and incentives.
I think
Sorry.
covered it.
Requirements and incentives. We haven't seen any examples of this being done as an incentive-based approach. But in our Planning Advisory Committee highly recommended that we do offer an incentive-based approach to this, and so we developed out of whole cloth a strategy for doing an ordinance like this on an incentive basis. And there is the possibility that you create it, again, demonstrating that the sky won't fall. You create it as an incentive. People get a little accustomed to it, feel like it's functioning. You see the impacts, hopefully, on the ground, and then you can have the discussion as to whether you make it something that's mandatory. But starting it as an incentive-based ordinance is a possibility for, in some ways, quote-unquote, piloting it.
And this is Catherine. I would add also that we've heard in some places, we worked in a number of partner communities, so in Cobb County, Georgia, where they are similarly not ready to jump to an ordinance, but they are working with a university campus there who will be on the campus, kind of treating the campus as a community that will be water neutral. When they do new building, they'll be retrofitting somewhere else. And so they're hoping that that will sort of work out some of the kinks and also show to developers that, hey, this is not really that difficult. So if they decide to move to an ordinance at some point, they'll have some examples locally to show how it works.
Great. I don't know, Bill, if you wanted to add anything about the easing into the process.
I don't think I have anything to add.
Research?
I think
okay.
They covered it great.
Okay. I wanted to throw out, and we've addressed a little bit about this related to the consumptive use versus diversions, but related to how NetBlue protects flows in rivers specifically. Adam, you touched on a little bit, but Catherine, I wonder if you would address that question.
Yeah, sure. I think the question is about what the role that an offset or water efficiency can play in protection of river. And although we've talked about the West, we haven't talked about the East as much. And I think I know one thing that our groups and communities see here is that when we have a lot of growth, one of the first responses is potentially to try, and there's a sort of shortage of available water supply, that communities will look to building new water storage, new reservoirs, or new infrastructure needed for to withdraw more water. And so this approach of a water offset can be something as part of this water management toolkit that uses a variety of water efficiency approaches, can show that you can have growth without having to actually build new reservoirs, and that's a way to protect the flow, more natural flows in your river. And so we've seen that. We've seen some groups effectively in the Southeast especially make the case that new reservoirs aren't needed if you factor in water efficiency and so forth. So this would be another tool to make that happen. And so I think NetBlue in itself doesn't necessarily protect flows in rivers, but it has the potential to do so, especially if you connect it with other tools or strategies that you might be using on the ground.
And Adam, I know you've had some cautions about this. If you want to chime in with that, that you haven't already said today.
I think that covered it well, and I agree completely with Catherine in terms of it can be a means of protection, and particularly when you couple it with other programs. I wouldn't view this inherently as a means of restoration, because again, I think it's very important. We were cautioned many times by the land use lawyers that we were working with that if you want this to pass a lawsuit, you've got to make sure that you're keeping it very closely tailored to the basically the potential impacts that could be occurring to the supply of water for that municipality. So as much as we have tried to build in here some elements of the environmental impacts, you can't go too far down that line, or else you may risk. Now, it may be worth it, but we're not recommending it necessarily. Risk basically judicial nullification.
Thanks for that. I want to highlight on this slide where we'd love to hear, before we wrap up here, if any of you are thinking about how you might be planning to use this in your community, and any other materials that might be helpful. I'm sure that might be a little bit more in context after you've had a chance to look at the website to see what we've got, but just we're interested in this. And before we get off questions, I wanted to circle back to Amy in Montana, who just left us with one point here, that when Mountain Water started treating effluent with land application, doing land application for their water, wastewater, she says, we started analyzing their water rights at 10% consumptive versus 5% during the growing season. So she was going back just to bring it back to the conversation about the consumptive versus diversions that we talked about earlier. And I don't know that anybody needs to answer that. I wanted to give her the chance to point that out. So something interesting.
Yeah, I think what you do with your wastewater makes a huge difference as to whether you're ultimately being consumptive, to the degree to which you're being consumptive or not. So yeah, land application of your wastewater certainly is so I think similarly to if you start having a lot more parks and you have more large lawns and so forth, your consumptive use is going to go up. So I agree.
All right, we're going to, and this will be the last one, which is one that I know has come up for us in our discussions around the country, is what if our community already has a development impact fee for water supply? We see more of these. How do we incorporate NetBlue offsets in that case?
Carefully.
Adam, do you want to start? Yeah.
I think it really depends on what your impact fee covers. And this is a question that we've gotten a fair amount, and it's a very good question, and it's something really important to consider in all of this. When you start this process, if you're considering going down this route, what does your impact fee cover? What does it not cover? And to what extent might it overlap with something that you'd be trying to accomplish through a NetBlue ordinance? Don't double dip. If you're already covering the costs of what the new development is going to have on your water supply, not just your infrastructure, then this might not be an appropriate way to go. If you're just covering infrastructure, but you're not considering, as Bill had mentioned, what the additional supplies are going to cost you in order to be able to get the water to deliver to your customers, then there may be something here that is sufficiently distinct from what you currently have to be able to make it work. But it deserves a lot of caution because you certainly don't want to have this be duplicative. Okay.
Bill, any final words, any final thoughts on the offset methodology piece of the puzzle?
Not really. We would love feedback as users get into it and use it. Any feedback would be much encouraged. Any questions, don't hesitate to ask AWE. And AWE is also likely going to generate some videos that go through the use of the workbook using those 3 examples. So keep an eye out for that. Those will be posted online on the NetBlue website as soon as those are complete.
Okay, as we wrap up here, please, please, please remember to complete the evaluation survey that will come your way as you in an email within a day, so not as you close down necessarily. And we really, really do use your feedback to make our future webinars better. So thank you so much. Be in touch with us about questions. In that follow-up email will be all of our contact information, as well as the link to the recording. So feel free to share it with others. And don't hesitate to go to the website where you can see more about the project, and the NetBlue Toolkit is available for you, net-blue.org. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it so much.